the dust of Redemption Gulch settled on everything with a fine ochre patience. It coated the unpainted planks of the general store, the drooping brim of a man's hat, and the silent, determined shoulders of Martha Thorne. For weeks, the town had watched her. They watched as she methodically, almost ritualistically, hauled bricks from a borrowed handcart to the center of her small cabin. She was a widow of 2 years, a woman whose quiet presence had always been as predictable as the sunrise. Now, her actions were a puzzle, a slow-motion spectacle that drew murmurs from behind weathered shutters and curious glances over split-rail fences. Inside her one-room dwelling, a strange altar was taking shape. It was not a hearth, for it sat squarely in the middle of the floor, far from any wall where a chimney might logically rise. It was a low, wide platform of brick and mortar, meticulously laid, with a curious opening at one end and a small iron door scavenged from a defunct cookstove. Samuel Pritchard, her nearest neighbor, finally let his curiosity get the better of him. He leaned on the fence separating their properties, his face a mask of bewildered concern. "Martha," he called out, his voice raspy from the dry air. "Begging your pardon, but what in creation are you building in there?" "Looks like you're fixing to bake bread right on your floors." Martha paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of a gritty hand. She offered no smile, just a look of weary resolve. "It's a bed, Samuel. A place to keep warm when the snows come." Samuel blinked. He looked at the hard, rectangular mass of brick, then back at her. A slow, pitying shake of his head followed. "A bed? Made of brick? Martha, that's a tomb you're building. You'll freeze harder on that than on a block of river ice." She did not argue. She simply picked up another brick, tested its weight, and turned back to her work, leaving Samuel to mutter to his fence post about the strange turns a mind could take when left to grief and solitude. The whispers in town grew from curious to concerned, and then, inevitably, to mocking. The children started calling it Granny Thorne's brick box. The men at the saloon joked about her plan to sleep on a pile of rocks. But Martha paid them no mind. She had a diagram, pressed and faded, in a book her late husband, Robert, had brought back from his travels as a merchant sailor. It was a book filled with sketches of strange devices and foreign lands, and on one page, a detailed drawing of something called a cangai heated bed. A Chinese invention, the text said, for surviving winters that would snap the soul of a man. She had no one to help her, no son to haul the heavy loads, no brother to check her work. There was only the memory of Robert's voice, reading aloud from his books, his fascination with the practical ingenuity of people in faraway places. This was her inheritance. Not land, not money, but an idea. And as the autumn air began to bite, an idea was worth more than gold. The ridicule did not deter her, it was merely a sound, like the buzzing of flies, that existed outside the precise world she was constructing. Each brick was a small victory against the coming cold, each layer of mortar a line of defense. Her late husband, Robert, had been a man who believed in a different kind of knowledge, one not found in the sermons at the town's small church or the predictable chatter at the general store. He had sailed to the Orient, to places the townsfolk of Redemption Gulch could barely imagine, and he had returned not with silks or spices, but with books filled with peculiar drawings and notes. It was in one of these books, its leather cover cracked and spine-weary from travel, that she had found the solution to her most pressing fear, the biting, relentless cold of a high desert winter. The diagram of the Kang was not just a picture, it was a promise. It showed a firebox connected to a serpentine channel, a maze of flues running through a solid brick platform before venting out a chimney. The principle was simple, yet profound. Instead of letting the precious heat of a fire roar up a chimney and vanish into the sky, this design captured it. The smoke and hot gases would be forced to take a long, winding journey, their energy slowly seeping into the dense brick, turning the entire structure into a massive, slow-releasing radiator. Samuel, however, saw none of this. He saw only a widow, alone and perhaps unhinged, building a folly. He came by again a week later, his expression even more troubled. "Martha, the preacher is asking after you," he said, avoiding looking directly at the nearly completed structure. "Folks are worried. They think you're not well." Martha was mixing her last batch of mortar, her movements economical and practiced. I'm quite well, Samuel. Just busy. Winter doesn't wait for a person to feel ready. He finally gestured at the brick platform. But this thing. There's no sense to it. You'll light a fire in that little box, and all the smoke will fill your cabin. You'll suffocate in your sleep on your brick bed. She looked up at him, her gaze clear and steady. The smoke will go up the chimney, Samuel. Just like yours, but the heat won't go anywhere. It's trapped in the brick. You need an open fire to feel the warmth, to heat the air. Everyone knows that it was the core of his misunderstanding, the central flaw in the town's logic. They understood heat as a direct, visible force, the radiant glow of an open flame, the blast of warmth from a pot-bellied stove. The idea of indirect, stored heat was as foreign as the land from which the design had come. She knew explaining the concept of thermal mass would be pointless. Words like conduction and radiation were not part of his world. So she offered a simple, maddeningly vague response. It will work. Her certainty was a wall he could not breach. He left that day convinced she was lost to reason, a sad story to be told over mugs of ale. He told his wife, Mary, that Martha Thorne was building her own mausoleum, and they should prepare to bring her charity baskets when the first blizzard hit. He felt a profound sense of pity, never once considering that his pity was profoundly misplaced. The work was arduous, a testament to the quiet power of solitary determination. Martha was not a large woman, and the bricks felt heavier each day. Her back ached, her hands were raw and scraped, and the fine dust of the mortar seemed to have settled permanently into the lines of her face. Yet, she persisted. She followed the diagram with the faith of a zealot, measuring the dimensions of the flues, ensuring the channels were smooth and unobstructed. This was not just masonry, it was a form of engineering, a practical science passed down through generations an ocean away. The structure was now complete, a monolithic presence in her small home. It stood 2 feet high, 7 feet long, and 4 feet wide, a solid block of reddish-brown brick that consumed the center of the room. On its surface, she laid a simple straw-stuffed mattress and her worn quilts. At the foot of the bed, the small iron door of the firebox sat flush with the brickwork. At the head, a thin stovepipe snaked up and out through a carefully sealed hole in the roof. To the uninitiated eye, it was an absurdity. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor of the general store, had been one of the most vocal mockers, though always with a smile. He had sold her the bricks, after all. Building a new root cellar, are we, Martha? He had asked jovially as she paid for the last load. A bit small for that, isn't it? She had merely nodded, her silence unnerving him more than any retort could have. Now, as the last days of October bled into the cold reality of November, the laughter began to subside, replaced by a waiting, watchful silence. The first frost painted the landscape in shades of silver and white. The nights grew teeth. In the cabins of Redemption Gulch, fireplaces were lit, their hungry flames devouring cords of precious firewood. The air filled with the scent of pine smoke, a familiar perfume of the changing season. Martha waited. She waited for the cold to truly settle in, to seep into the very bones of the earth. Then, one evening, as a bitter wind began to howl around the corners of her cabin, she decided it was time. She took a small bundle of kindling, nothing more than a handful of twigs and a few splintered pieces of scrap wood, and placed it inside the firebox. She added 2 small, dry logs, barely thicker than a man's wrist. It was a laughably small amount of fuel, an amount that would burn out in an open hearth in less than an hour, providing a fleeting circle of warmth before dying to embers. With a steady hand, she struck a match and lit the kindling. The flame caught, a flicker of orange in the dark iron box. She closed the heavy door, adjusted a small flue damper at the base of the chimney, and then she waited. There was no roar, no great burst of heat. There was only a low, quiet hum and the faint, almost imperceptible warmth beginning to radiate from the iron door. An observer would have seen nothing remarkable. Just a tiny, contained fire, seemingly useless against the encroaching winter. The first few hours were a quiet test of faith. Martha sat in her rocking chair, a quilt over her lap, listening to the muffled crackle from within the brick platform. The air in the cabin remained chilly. A draft snaked under the door, a cold reminder of the night's power. Doubt, a sly and unwelcome visitor, tried to whisper in her ear. Had she made a terrible mistake? Had she spent her last reserves of strength and money on a dead man's fanciful drawing? She rested a hand on the brick surface beside her. It was still cool to the touch. She knew the process was meant to be slow. The diagram's notes had emphasized patience. The goal was not to heat the air, but to heat the mass. She banked the small fire, ensuring it would burn slowly and steadily through the night, and climbed onto her new bed. The straw mattress offered little insulation against the brick, and a deep, stony cold seemed to emanate from below. She shivered, pulling her quilts tighter, the mocking laughter of the townsfolk echoing in her memory. But as the hours passed, a subtle transformation began. The deep, penetrating cold of the bricks began to recede, replaced by a neutral stillness. Then, ever so slowly, a gentle, pervasive warmth started to rise. It was not the scorching heat of a nearby flame but something far more profound. It was a deep, radiant heat that seemed to come from within the bed itself, warming the mattress, the quilts, and her body from below. By dawn, the surface of the brick platform was not just warm, it was a source of steady, comforting heat that filled the entire space beneath her blankets. Outside, the world was frozen. A thick layer of frost covered everything, and the water in Samuel's outdoor trough was solid. He emerged from his cabin, bundled in a heavy coat, his breath pluming in the frigid air. He glanced towards Martha's cabin, a thin wisp of smoke curling from her new chimney pipe. He shook his head, a familiar gesture of pity. Poor woman, he muttered to himself. A fire that small won't do a thing. She must be frozen half to death in there, but Martha was not frozen. She was, for the first time in a winter, perfectly, deeply warm. The temperature on the surface of her brick bed had reached a steady 87 degrees. The heat radiated upwards, creating a pocket of warmth that the cabin's drafts could not penetrate. More remarkably, the air in the small room was no longer frigid. The massive brick structure, now thoroughly saturated with heat, was slowly releasing its energy into the surrounding space, raising the ambient temperature from freezing to a comfortable, livable level. She had used less wood in one night than Samuel would use before breakfast, yet she was warmer than he could ever hope to be, huddled next to his roaring, inefficient fireplace. As winter tightened its grip, the disparity between Martha's cabin and the rest of the town became a stark, unspoken reality. The men of Redemption Gulch were now spending a significant portion of their days chopping and hauling wood. The sound of axes biting into frozen timber was a constant refrain. Firewood, once plentiful, was becoming a currency of survival. Piles stacked high in the autumn were shrinking at an alarming rate. Inside their homes, families lived a life of concentric circles. There was the small, fiercely hot zone directly in front of the fireplace, and then there was the rest of the house, where the cold held dominion. They wore their coats indoors, their breath fogging in the corners of the rooms. The constant battle was against the drafts, the icy air that seeped through the chinks in the logs and the gaps around the door frames. Their large, roaring fires were a paradox. They produced immense heat, but most of it shot straight up the chimney, pulling the cold air from the rest of the house in to replace it. They were, in essence, running powerful but deeply inefficient engines of warmth. Martha's life was different. Her daily routine involved a single, simple task: feeding her stove. Once in the morning and once in the evening, she would open the small iron door and add a few pieces of wood. Her woodpile, which the town had deemed pitifully small for a winter, barely seemed to shrink. There were no roaring flames in her cabin, no dramatic play of light and shadow from a hungry fire. There was only a quiet, constant, and pervasive warmth. The brick bed, her kang, had become the heart of her home. It was a thermal battery, charged twice a day, that steadily discharged its heat over 12-hour cycles. The entire mass of brick remained warm to the touch, day and night. She could sit anywhere in the room and be comfortable. She did her mending without shivering, prepared her meals without her fingers growing numb. The townsfolk noticed. They saw the meager plume of smoke from her chimney and drew their own conclusions. She must be rationing her wood to the point of freezing, Mary Pritchard said to her husband, her voice laced with genuine concern. Someone should check on her. Samuel, feeling a nagging sense of responsibility, decided he would. He trudged through the snow to her door, his mind rehearsing a gentle speech about community and accepting help. He was prepared to find her huddled under a mountain of blankets, her face pale with cold. He knocked firmly. When the door opened, his prepared words died on his lips. It was not a blast of frigid air that greeted him, but a wave of soft, gentle warmth. It was unlike the aggressive, dry heat from his own fireplace. This was a stable, comfortable heat that seemed to emanate from the very floor and walls. Martha stood before him in a simple dress, with no shawl or heavy coat. She was not shivering. Her cheeks had a healthy color. His eyes darted past her to the brick structure. It sat there, silent and solid. There was no fire visible, no glowing embers. Yet the room was warmer and more pleasant than his own crowded kitchen. Samuel stepped inside, his boots heavy with snow, his mind struggling to reconcile what his senses were telling him. He looked around the cabin, his gaze landing on the small, tidy wood box next to the brick bed. It was still nearly full. His own wood box, 3 times the size, was already half empty, and it was only midday. He felt a prickle of disbelief, a sense that the laws of nature as he understood them had been suspended within these 4 walls. "Martha," he began, his voice softer than he intended, "we were worried. The smoke from your chimney is so light. We thought you were out of wood." Martha gestured towards the wood box. "I have plenty, Samuel. More than enough to see me through." He took another step into the room, his eyes fixed on the brick platform. The air around it felt distinctly warmer. He couldn't help himself. He reached out a hesitant hand and laid it flat on the brick surface, away from her mattress. He snatched it back as if burned. Not because it was painfully hot, but because the heat was so profound, so utterly unexpected. It was a deep, penetrating warmth that radiated from the solid mass. He pressed his hand against it again, slower this time, letting the sensation sink in. It was the temperature of a perfectly heated stone you might pull from the embers of a fire to warm your hands, but this heat was present across the entire, massive surface. "But how?" he stammered, looking from the bed to the small, cold iron door of the firebox. "The fire is out." "The fire is not out," Martha corrected him gently. "It's simply very small. It smolders. It doesn't need to be large." She walked over to the firebox and opened the door. Inside, a single log glowed with deep red embers, consuming itself with an almost imperceptible slowness. It was a tiny heart of fire, beating faintly within the great brick body. The sight was so contrary to his lifelong experience with fire that Samuel felt a sense of vertigo. He had always believed a bigger fire meant more heat. It was the fundamental principle of a winter hearth. You fed the beast, and it kept the wolves of winter at bay. Martha's beast was a tiny, sleeping creature, yet it was doing a better job. She saw the confusion on his face, the crumbling of his certainty, and for the first time, she offered a full explanation. She didn't use scientific terms, but practical ones he could understand. "The smoke doesn't go straight up, Samuel," she said, her voice calm and instructive. "The heat from this little fire is forced to travel a long way." She traced a winding path with her finger along the side of the brick structure. "It goes back and forth, through channels inside, before it can escape. By the time the smoke reaches the chimney, most of the warmth has been trapped by the bricks. The bricks hold onto it, you see. They soak it up like a sponge and then let it out slowly, all day and all night." He listened, his skepticism finally giving way to a dawning, humbling understanding. It was a trick. A brilliant, simple trick. Instead of throwing fuel at the problem, this design captured and preserved every last bit of energy. It wasn't about the size of the fire, it was about the efficiency of the heat transfer. He thought of his own fireplace, a great stone cavern that consumed logs as fast as he could feed it. He pictured the massive column of superheated air and smoke billowing from his chimney, a visible plume of wasted energy painting a stripe against the grey winter sky. He was not heating his house, he was heating the whole of Redemption Gulch. The irony of his earlier pity was a sharp, bitter taste in his mouth. He had stood on his side of the fence, feeling sorry for the poor, delusional widow, while he was the one living in a state of primitive inefficiency, a slave to his own roaring fire. He looked at Martha, truly looked at her, and saw not a fragile woman lost to grief, but an innovator, a quiet genius who had outsmarted the winter itself. He thought of the weeks he had watched her, the jokes he had heard and perhaps even repeated. The entire town had been laughing at a solution to a problem that plagued every single one of them. He finally understood. The bed wasn't a tomb. It was a hearth. A revolutionary, self-contained, hyper-efficient hearth that you could sleep on. It was a stove, a bed, and a heated floor all in one. He walked the perimeter of the structure, running his hand along its warm sides. The engineering was elegant in its simplicity. No moving parts, no complex mechanisms. Just brick, mortar, and a deep understanding of thermodynamics, passed from an ancient culture to a curious sailor, and now to his determined widow. "My Robert," Martha said softly, as if reading his thoughts, "he always said there were clever people everywhere, and a wise man pays attention to how they live." Samuel nodded slowly, his mind reeling with the implications. He thought of his wife and children, bundled in blankets in the next room, while the fire raged just feet away. He thought of the dwindling woodpile and the long, cold months still to come. "Martha," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect, could you show me the drawing?" She went to a small wooden chest and removed the worn leather book. She opened it to the page, the paper thin and fragile, and handed it to him. He stared at the intricate diagram of the Kang, the strange foreign script, and the simple, elegant lines that depicted the serpentine flues. It was a map to a better way of surviving, and it had been here, in this quiet cabin, all along. The story of Samuel's visit spread through Redemption Gulch faster than a prairie fire. It started with his wife, Mary, who saw the look on his face when he returned home. It was not the look of a man who had visited a pitiable neighbor, it was the look of a man who had seen a miracle. He didn't just tell her, he showed her. He took her to Martha's cabin, and she too felt the impossible warmth and touched the heated bricks. The next day, Mr. Henderson, the store owner, made a visit on the pretense of checking Martha's supplies. He left with a sheepish expression, his earlier jokes about her brick root cellar surely echoing in his ears. He was a practical man, a man of commerce, and he understood efficiency when he saw it. He immediately calculated the cost of the bricks against the cost of the firewood she was saving and realized Martha had made the shrewdest investment of anyone in town. Soon, a small but steady trickle of visitors made their way to the widow's door. They came with skepticism in their eyes but left with wonder. They came to mock but stayed to learn. Martha, ever patient, showed them the small fire, let them touch the warm bricks, and explained the simple principle her husband had learned of so many years ago. The Chinese bed stove, once a term of ridicule, was now spoken with a tone of awe. It was no longer Granny Thorne's brick box, it was the Thorne heater. Men who had spent their lives building traditional fireplaces, men who prided themselves on their practical skills, stood before the brick platform and confessed their ignorance. They had focused on the fire, not on the heat. They had mistaken the spectacle of the flame for the substance of its energy. The contrast between their lives and Martha's was a daily lesson. While they woke to frozen floors and a desperate race to rekindle a dead fire, Martha woke in a cocoon of warmth. While their fuel costs mounted, hers remained negligible. The most profound validation came during the Great Blizzard of '88. For 3 days, a relentless storm buried Redemption Gulch under a thick blanket of snow. The temperature plummeted to depths no one could remember. The wind howled like a starving wolf, testing every wall and finding every crack. It was a time of true crisis. Fuel became life. In homes across the town, families huddled together, feeding their fireplaces constantly, yet the cold was an invading army that could not be repelled. The air was thick with smoke, but the chill remained. During this siege, a small group of men, including Samuel and Mr. Henderson, formed a patrol to check on the vulnerable. Their greatest fear was for the widow, alone in her cabin. They imagined the worst, that her tiny, strange fire would be no match for the storm's fury. They fought their way through waist-deep drifts, the wind stealing their breath, and finally reached her door. They knocked, expecting no answer. When the door swung open, the scene that greeted them was so incongruous with the howling chaos outside that it felt like a vision from another world. The interior of Martha's cabin was an oasis of serene warmth. There were no drafts, no sense of a desperate battle against the elements. Martha was sitting in her rocking chair, calmly mending a torn flour sack by the light of a single lantern. The air was warm and still. The brick bed emanated a steady, comforting heat that held the blizzard at bay. She offered them hot tea, and as the men stood there, stamping the snow from their boots and letting the feeling return to their frozen fingers, they were silent. The full measure of her achievement was laid bare. She had not just built a clever stove, she had built a fortress against the winter. Her small home was the most comfortable, the most secure, and the most efficient dwelling in the entire town. The quiet widow, whom they had pitied and mocked, was surviving the worst storm in memory with more grace and comfort than any of them. The blizzard broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a world of stunning white silence. The immediate crisis was over, but the lessons learned were only just beginning to take root. The men who had stood in Martha's warm cabin carried the memory back to their own cold, drafty homes. The story of her survival, of her triumph, became a local legend. The diagram in her husband's book was no longer a curiosity, it was a blueprint for the future. That spring, a new sound was heard in Redemption Gulch. It was not the chopping of wood for the next winter, but the chipping of mortar and the laying of brick. Samuel Pritchard was the first. With Martha's permission and her careful guidance, he began constructing a kang in his own home, modifying the design to fit his family's needs. Mr. Henderson was next, commissioning one for his own quarters behind the store. He saw a business opportunity, of course, but his motivation was also born of genuine respect. He began stocking more bricks and iron firebox doors, anticipating a shift in the local economy from firewood to masonry. The ridicule was a distant memory, replaced by a deep and abiding respect for the woman they had so profoundly underestimated. Martha Thorne had not sought to teach them a lesson. She had only sought to survive. But in securing her own warmth, she had kindled a new kind of fire in the community, a fire of innovation, of humility, and of the quiet wisdom that recognizes a good idea, no matter how far it has traveled to reach you. Her husband's legacy was not just a book or a drawing, but a fundamental change in the way an entire town lived, a change brought about by the steadfast determination of one woman who dared to build a bed of brick. The seasons turned, and the legacy of the Thorne heater solidified, becoming as much a part of Redemption Gulch as the dust and the distant mountains. The following winter was a different experience for the families who had adopted the new technology. Their homes were warmer, their woodpiles stayed higher, and their days were not consumed by the relentless toil of feeding a hungry fire. The change was more than just practical, it was psychological. The gnawing anxiety of winter, the fear of running out of fuel or of a sudden, brutal cold snap, began to recede. Martha's idea had brought them not just warmth, but a measure of peace. She never sought praise or position. She remained the quiet widow in her small cabin, but her status in the community had been irrevocably transformed. She was no longer an object of pity or suspicion, but a source of wisdom. Neighbors would stop by not with charity baskets, but with questions about flue design or the best mixture for mortar. She became an unlikely consultant, a respected engineer whose authority came not from a fancy degree, but from proven, undeniable results. The story serves as a powerful reminder of how easily we can dismiss what we do not understand. The people of Redemption Gulch were not cruel or foolish, they were simply bound by their own experiences. Their understanding of the world was shaped by generations of building open fires in stone hearths. The concept of capturing and storing heat was so alien to their way of thinking that it appeared nonsensical. They laughed at Martha's brick bed for the same reason people often laugh at new ideas, it challenged their fundamental assumptions about how the world was supposed to work. Her quiet persistence in the face of this communal skepticism is a testament to the strength of conviction. She possessed a form of knowledge that her neighbors lacked, and she had the courage to trust it over their collective, confident ignorance. You can imagine the internal fortitude required to continue hauling those bricks, day after day, while the entire world you know is telling you that you are mad. Her vindication was not loud or boastful, it was as quiet and steady as the warmth from her bed. It was in Samuel's humbled request to see the diagram. It was in the silent awe of the men who took refuge from the blizzard in her cabin. It was in the eventual, widespread adoption of her methods. Her story also highlights the fascinating, often invisible, journey of ideas across cultures. A piece of practical knowledge, perfected over centuries in the cold northern provinces of China, found its way across the vastness of the Pacific Ocean in a sailor's book and was finally put to use in the harsh environment of the American West. It's a testament to the universality of human challenges, like staying warm, and the ingenuity that arises to meet them, regardless of geography or language. The Kang was a perfect technology for its new environment. It used minimal resources, was built from simple materials like clay and brick, and provided a massive advantage in a land where winters were long and fuel was labor-intensive. The final, reflective lesson is perhaps about the nature of wisdom itself. It is often found not in the loudest voices or the most popular opinions, but in the quiet corners, in old books, in forgotten practices, and in the determined hands of those who are willing to build something new, even if they have to do it alone, brick by patient brick. Martha Thorne's Chinese bed stove kept her warm at 87 degrees all winter, but its true legacy was the enduring warmth of a lesson well learned by an entire community.